In 1892, an exhibition of Edvard Munch's paintings in Berlin was shut down after only 1 week. Critics called the work unfinished, ugly, even mentally diseased. One reviewer wrote that Munch's paintings looked as though they had been smeared directly onto the canvas in a state of fever. What disturbed people was not simply the subject matter. European paintings already contained death, religion, tragedy, and suffering. What unsettled viewers was that Munch seemed uninterested in painting external reality at all. Instead, he painted perception under emotional strain. His figures do not simply look sad, they appear psychologically altered by grief, anxiety, jealousy, illness, or isolation. Faces dissolve, space becomes unstable, color behaves emotionally rather than realistically. Long before psychiatry developed modern language for trauma or anxiety disorders, Munch had already begun painting what it feels like when the mind itself becomes an unreliable environment. And that impulse did not emerge from theory. It emerged from a life shaped very early by death, illness, religious fear, and the persistent suspicion that he himself might be psychologically damaged. Edvard Munch was born in Norway in 1863, into a family already marked by fragility. His mother died from tuberculosis when he was 5 years old. His older sister, Sophie, died from the same illness at 15. Another sister was later diagnosed with severe mental illness and institutionalized for much of her life. Munch grew up under the care of a father whose religious devotion gradually became intertwined with anxiety, guilt, and apocalyptic fear. In his journals, Munch described his childhood home as dominated by sickness and the fear of God. Years later, he wrote one of the most revealing lines in all of his notebooks. Illness, insanity, and death were the black angels that stood at my cradle. This was not a metaphorical exaggeration. Tuberculosis in 19th century Europe was everywhere, slow and psychologically terrifying. Families often watched relatives and loved ones deteriorate for years before agonizing death. Modern psychologists sometimes describe children raised in chronically unstable environments as developing hypervigilance, a nervous system that becomes excessively alert to danger, emotional shifts, or signs of catastrophe. When you look at Munch's paintings, they often feel created from precisely that condition. His figures rarely seem secure inside the world. Even ordinary rooms carry emotional tension, as though disaster has either just happened or is silently approaching. Munch returned obsessively to the death of his sister Sophie throughout his life, but nowhere more intensely than in The Sick Child. He painted multiple versions of that work over the decades, almost as though the memory itself refused to settle into a finished form. When the painting was first exhibited in 1886, critics were scandalized. One reviewer complained that it looked scraped and scratched like an abandoned sketch. But that instability is exactly the point. The Sick Child does not function like a conventional 19th century realism. It behaves more like a traumatic recollection. The image flickers between presence and disappearance. The brushstrokes seem agitated. Faces blur into paint. Even the room feels emotionally fragile. Today, trauma researchers often describe painful memory not as a coherent narrative, but as a fragmented sensory return, repetitive, unstable, resistant to orderly representation. Munch could not have known this language formally, yet his paintings intuitively anticipated. He once wrote, I paint not what I see, but what I saw, and that distinction matters enormously. Munch was not documenting events objectively. He was painting emotional after-images, the way memory changes under grief, the way suffering continues to distort perception long after the original event has ended. And perhaps that is why these paintings still feel contemporary. They resemble the inner texture of memory more than the historical scenes from the 19th century. Although Munch is remembered primarily as a painter of death and anxiety, many of his most psychologically complex works are actually about intimacy, or more precisely, the fear of intimacy. His relationships were often turbulent, obsessive, and emotionally unstable. He feared abandonment, yet also feared emotional dependence itself. This contradiction appears repeatedly in his paintings. In Vampire, for example, a woman bends over a man whose face disappears into darkness. The image is ambiguous, simultaneously tender and suffocating. In Ashes, two lovers stand in the aftermath of what feels less like romance than emotional devastation. Munch's paintings often suggest that love does not merely connect people, it exposes them psychologically. Modern psychoanalytic thinkers would later describe intimacy as something capable of destabilizing the self, forcing confrontation with vulnerability, dependency, rejection, and loss of control. Again, Munch seemed to understand this instinctively. His lovers rarely appear peaceful. Even in closeness, his figures often seem isolated inside their own emotional worlds. And that emotional isolation may be one of the reasons contemporary viewers still respond so strongly to his work. Because Munch understood that loneliness is not simply the absence of people. Sometimes it emerges most painfully in the presence of others. The scream has become so culturally familiar that it's easy to forget how strange the painting actually is. It is not merely an image of fear, it's an image of existential destabilization. In his diary, Munch described the moment that inspired the work as, "I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature." The most important detail in that passage is that the scream does not originate from the figure. It comes from existence itself. The landscape twists unnaturally, perspective becomes unstable, the sky behaves emotionally rather than physically. This is not realism, it is psychological projection. And in many ways, the painting anticipates modern understandings of anxiety remarkably well. Clinical anxiety is often not experienced as fear of one concrete object. Instead, people describe diffused dread, derealization, bodily panic, or the sensation that the world itself no longer feels safe or stable. Munch transformed that internal experience into visual form decades before psychology could adequately describe it. That may be why the scream still resonates so powerfully in the 21st century. Not because modern audiences romanticize suffering, but because painting captures something psychologically recognizable, the terrifying moment when emotional distress begins to alter perception itself. After all that's been said today, reducing Munch to despair alone would be incomplete, because scattered throughout his work are moments of quietness, tenderness, even fragile serenity. Paintings like The Sun or Girls in the Bridge suggest that he was still searching for emotional coherence, for moments in which the world briefly stopped feeling threatening. But he never entirely escaped the conviction that suffering and consciousness were deeply connected. At one point, Munch wrote, "Without anxiety and illness, I am a ship without a rudder." It is a profoundly tragic sentence because it suggests that he eventually became unable to imagine identity outside suffering itself. And perhaps this is why his paintings continue to affect viewers so deeply. Not because they're simply dark, but because they acknowledge something modern culture often tries to suppress. That vulnerability is not abnormal, and grief permanently alters perception. That anxiety can reshape reality and memory can become unstable. And that emotional pain does not always disappear simply because time has passed. Munch's paintings remain powerful because they do not treat suffering as spectacle. They treat it as a part of consciousness itself. And that is why, more than a century later, it still feels uncomfortably true.